In this lesson, we're going to create a dialogue using the Watson Conversation tooling. We're also going to introduce a new concept, context. We'll learn about context as we build our dialogue. Our dialogue will help users find information about national parks. We're going to start very simple. Here are the requirements. Prompt the user, asking him what national park he'd like to know about. A user might ask, "What parks can you tell me about?" We should be able to respond with the list of parks that we know about. And finally, we want to store and retrieve the list of national parks using conversation context. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing we want to do is create a new workspace. And we'll call it National Parks Example. And create. Okay, so we're brought into the tooling. Now, our first requirement is to prompt the user with a question. What national park would you like to know about? So that we don't need an intent or an entity to do that. So let's jump right over to Dialog. And we're going to create a new dialogue. And as you see, it immediately gives you the conversation starts virtual node and our first child, which in this case is also a top level node. So let's start populating it. We want to prompt our user at the start of the conversation, and only at the start of the conversation. This is the perfect use for the conversation start condition, as it's only executed once on conversation start. Next, we'll add our response, in this case, our prompt. What national park would you like to know about? You may have noticed that the tooling automatically created an anything else node. The anything else node enables us to provide a fallback answer when Watson can't identify the intent. As expected, the anything else node is triggered by the anything else condition. Let's go ahead and provide our fallback or anything else response. Cool. Let's go ahead and test what we've created so far. At the start of our conversation, we immediately respond with, "What national park would you like to know about?" If we respond with, "How about Yosemite?" you'll notice that we don't capture an intent. As expected, we haven't trained one, but we do fall over to our anything else node, and we get the response, "I didn't understand that." Let's make a few improvements and add some variety to both our conversation start response and our anything else response. From our conversation start node, we have our response, "What national park would you like to know about?" Let's also add, "I'm here to provide information about national parks. What park are you interested in?" And let's display these prompts randomly. Now let's add some variety to our anything else responses. So we already have, "I didn't understand that." Let's alter that a bit. "I didn't understand that," asking about a national park. And let's add, "Sorry, I'm only trained on national parks. What park would you like to know about?" And let's set this to sequential. Let's now give our conversation a try with the new changes. Let's press the clear button a few times. This will reset the conversation, and we can see that the prompt is indeed random. Let's now enter a few utterances so that we can see how the anything else response behaves. We get the "I didn't understand that" response first, the "Sorry, I'm only trained on" response next, and it resets to the "I didn't understand that" response. All in all, the responses are coming back sequentially as we've defined them. Our next requirement is to detect the list parks intent. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to close this out, and we'll hop over to intents. Let's go ahead and create our new intent. We'll give it a name, list parks, and we'll add some examples. We should have at least 5. And press create once done. And now we'll hop over to test it. We'll see that Watson is training. I'm going to clear out the last conversation. We'll fast forward a bit, and Watson's done training. Let's go ahead and try, "Can I see a list of parks?" And as you can see, the list parks intent was detected. However, we respond with the default response. On to our third requirement. Let's go ahead and create the response to be used when our list parks intent is identified. To do this, we'll open the dialog editor. Here we see that both our conversation start and our anything else nodes are listed. Remember that nodes are evaluated in the order that they appear. We want to evaluate list parks after conversation start, but before anything else. To do that, we can expand the conversation start node and add a new node. It will be triggered by list parks, and we'll add the response. I can tell you about Yosemite, Yellowstone, and Arches. Okay, let's give it a try again. Can I see a list of parks? And this time we see the new response. Let's now tackle our fourth requirement, using context to manage parks. The list of parks might be used in many responses, and the way we've constructed our dialog so far, we would have to duplicate those names in any response that uses them. Also, if we decide to add a new park, we may want to update many of those responses. Let's see how we can get a bit more reuse out of parks by using context variables. Let's add a new context variable that holds the list of national parks. Let's close this editor and open the conversation start node. We'll add our context variable to this node, which will ensure that the variable is available right when the conversation begins. To add a new context variable, we need to use the advanced editor. To activate the advanced editor, we click on the 3 dots enclosed by the 2 braces. This puts us in advanced mode. Here you'll see a JSON representation of the response that we created in simple mode. Here are our responses in simple mode, advanced mode, and the selection policy in simple, and advanced mode. Okay, so let's now create a context variable. First, we're going to create a context property. It should be a sibling to the output property. Let's now create a parks property inside context that will hold our list of national parks. Let's now see how it works. Let's open the Chrome Developer Tools. We'll go to the Network tab, and I'm going to clear the conversation. This will invoke the Conversation API's message endpoint with a payload that will reset the conversation. This means the conversation start node will be invoked. This is the same node that adds the context variable. Here you can see it in the response payload. Let's go ahead and use this context variable in our response. Okay, we'll close out this editor and we'll open up our list parks node and edit that. Here we see our response. So if I type something like list the parks, we'll see I can tell you about Yosemite, Yellowstone, and Arches. We created a context variable called parks, and it contains Yellowstone, Yosemite, and Arches. Let's update our response to use the context variable instead of the explicit text. You can access context variables very simply by using the $sign. So any root property that is in context can be accessed in this way. So we can use the parks context variable with $parks. Okay, let's try an example again. List parks. And as you can see, it makes use of our context variable. However, we see the string representation of our parks array, and we probably want to clean up that output. The Watson Conversation Service provides support for the Spring expression language, and we can use this language when creating conditions and responses. To embed a complex expression in a response, we can use this syntax. And as an example, here we use the Spring expression language to append Denali to our array of parks. Let's now see how we can use an expression to clean up our response. Let's use the long-form expression syntax here, and we'll see that this does exactly the same thing. Now let's use some simple JavaScript within our expression to clean up our response. We'll use the array's join method to join each element of the array into a single string. We'll use comma space as the separator. Let's try our input one last time. Show me a list of parks. And this time you can see that our response is printed nicely. Context has many uses and can be a very powerful tool. As you saw in our example, you can use context to get reuse out of your data. Context allows you to maintain conversational state. You can store just about anything you like in context. One of the most powerful uses of context, however, is to pass data between the client and the server, or the server and the client. The Watson Conversation Service itself uses context. It uses it to maintain the user's position in the dialog, the conversation ID, and more. Although context allows you to maintain state, the Watson Conversation API is completely stateless. Ultimately, this means that you should provide the context object with every API request that you make to the conversation message endpoint. In this section, we learned quite a bit. We learned how to add dialogue to our conversation using the Watson Conversation Service tooling. We also looked at how to prompt users, how to identify intents, specifically to list parks. We learned how to create simple responses as well as responses that contain complex expressions. And finally, we learned how to store and retrieve data using context.